right, well, good morning, and thanks for being here with us. My name is Bobby Zirkin. I'm former state senator, and I'm proud to be here on behalf of the Maryland State Bar Association in partnership with Stevenson University, interviewing all of the gubernatorial candidates who are seeking to become the next governor of the great state of Maryland. So I'm here with John Barren, Democratic candidate for governor. And John, thanks so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for doing this, and thanks to the State Bar Association for hosting, and to Stevenson University.
Sure. And so let's get started. I'm going to ask a lot about issues today, but before we do that, for those who may not know you, or can you talk a little bit about yourself? Who is John Barren, and how did you get here to become a candidate for governor for Maryland?
So I am a longtime Maryland resident. Let's start there. I've lived in Montgomery County, my wife and I, for 27 years, and I spent most of my childhood here. I actually went to the same public elementary and middle school that my kids went to, and I live 2 miles down the street from the house where I grew up. Career-wise, I'm a government reformer. I've led the charge to increase the effectiveness of government through rigorous evidence about what actually works to improve people's lives. So as a Clinton administration official, I headed roughly $1 billion technology program, and I won awards for reinventing government. Later, I founded a nonprofit that worked with the Bush and Obama administrations to get some major reforms in social spending programs, like in education and other areas, enacted into law. Most recently, I headed the largest philanthropic initiative in the nation that identifies and expands proven effective social programs. I've been an appointee of Democratic and Republican presidents, and I've twice been confirmed by the Senate. And I should mention, given the audience and the forum here, I am a lawyer. Yes, I'm a
All right.
I'm a lawyer.
Well, good. Well, and we're going to talk a lot about legal. And one of the questions I'll be asking later on is about the kind of the rise of hyperpartisanship. So it's interesting that you've been involved with administrations of both parties.
Correct.
Not an easy task to get confirmed by the United States Senate these days. So we'll get to that later on. We'll welcome, and let's just start with kind of the John Barren stump speech. What is, you've never held elected office before, so why should Marylanders vote for you for governor? What is it that you would bring to Maryland?
So I'm running because I believe Maryland can do so much better in education, wages, and health care. And I'm the one to get us there, because unlike others, I would expand programs and policies that don't just sound like good ideas, but have been tested in the real world and shown to make a big difference in people's lives. So I'll give you some concrete examples in a moment, but first let me just outline the problem. In the first area I mentioned, education. More than a quarter of middle school students in our state can't read at a basic level. More than a third can't do basic math. Those numbers are no different than they were 20 years ago. In the second area, wages and poverty. Poverty rate today in Maryland is 9%. You want to take a wild guess what it was in 1995? No. Who's doing the interviewing
here? I would assume
here?
It's a 9%.
It was 9%. Because for low and moderate income Marylanders, basically the bottom 40%, they've seen flat wages for decades while income inequality has been growing. In the third area, health care, more Marylanders are covered by health insurance thanks to Obamacare, but costs keep rising year after year. The average Maryland family pays 50% more in out-of-pocket medical expenses than they did 10 years ago after adjusting for inflation. All the problems that I just described are that much worse for Marylanders of color. It seems like everybody's had a new plan to solve these problems, but it's been decades. You're still mired in the same problems that are harming the lives of millions of people in Maryland. Clearly, we need to do something very different. That's what I'm offering. So I've been on a mission, as I described in my career, through my work in government, with government, and in philanthropy, to expand a new approach to problem solving. The idea, and this was what my nonprofit was devoted to, and we sparked a government-wide movement in the federal government. the idea that you test many different solutions to these problems, you rigorously test them, and then you expand those that are most effective. And that concept has guided my career, and it's been embedded in a number of pieces of legislation, as I've mentioned, in education and early childhood and other areas that we got enacted. Now it's time to bring this evidence-based approach that I've spearheaded to the state of Maryland. So, when I'm the governor of Maryland, we're going to do what's proven to work. I'll give you two quick examples. Number one, we will provide high-quality tutoring to every struggling first and second grader in the entire state, because it has been shown to move them up toward grade level early before their problems become serious in later grades. And we're going to do it by engaging the community, including retirees and recent college graduates, to become tutors for a modest stipend as a public service.
Okay.
Second example, statewide partnership with businesses across Maryland to provide effective job training to every young adult in Maryland who wants to advance. If it's done right, job training can be extremely effective, increasing earning. It's been shown to increase earnings as much as 40%, but the key is to focus that training on fast-growing industries like IT and healthcare, and to work very closely with local employers who provide paid internships to the trainees. So under my plan, the state will pay for the training, the businesses will pay for the internships, the economy gets skilled workers, everyone benefits from this. Those are two illustrative examples. I got a closet full. I could keep you here all afternoon, but I won't. Let me mention this. The key theme is this, that if we simply continue on our current path, we're going to be here in another 20 years and nothing will have changed. To make progress, we have to zero in on solutions that are tested and shown effective. That's why I'm running for governor. Let's do what works.
Okay. So the General Assembly did a long study, and I was there for most of it, which was the blueprint for education. And so that was what they had done. They I assume, I wasn't in those meetings, but assumed that they had looked at what they thought worked and didn't work and came up with what is a pretty expensive but a robust new education system. And it's not funded fully,
right.
But do you agree or disagree with, I guess I wasn't going to start with education, but you went there first,
right.
And I know that that's where you wanted to go, so let's start there. Do you agree or disagree with what the recommendations of the blueprint? And beyond the two proposals that you just stated, is there anything else that they shouldn't be doing that they have in that, or that they should be doing?
Well, I support the overall framework of Blueprint, including an increase in education spending. The thing that I would bring as governor that I believe is critical to ensure the effectiveness of the Blueprint reforms as they're being implemented is a focus on evidence about what works and what doesn't work, again, in the implementation of the Blueprint reforms.
So let me just ask you this about that,
Yeah.
about evidence-based, because I used to do things in juvenile justice, and we talked about evidence-based.
Right.
And that obviously makes sense, because you want to do things that have some data behind it. But in terms of like education spending, for instance, my recollection was that class size reduction, real class size reduction, not minimal, not going from 24 to 22, but really going from 24 to 12 or 13. When other states had done things like that, that was evidence-based to work. But it also cost, $7 billion to do that in the state of Maryland. And so what are the specific things that are evidence-based that you, beyond tutoring and job training, that either are good or bad within the blueprint?
So let me get to that in 1 second, but first let me say why that focus on what works is so critical. Because we've had a major increase in education spending before. During the 2000s, Maryland saw a major rise, about a 40% rise in spending statewide per pupil after adjusted for inflation. And as the Kirwan Commission found, that did not result in improved outcomes for students. So this time, as we look at new resources and all that, it really is absolutely critical that we focus like a laser beam on programs and policies that have been tested and shown effective. One thing we could do, as I mentioned, is tutoring in the early grades, provided to every struggling student. That would cost a relatively modest amount given the state budget, even including education budget, about $200 million a year. But that is a specific approach that could be, it's a point of intervention, early elementary school, where if you can get kids on track reading by third grade, you can have an enormous impact on downstream outcomes, long-term outcomes. There are other examples, to give you concrete examples. Career academies in high poverty high schools, for instance, that have a career theme like biotech or healthcare or IT or something like that, have been shown to be very effective at increasing long-term earnings. About 10 years later, these youth, now young adults, are earning about $2,500 more than they would have otherwise without the career academy.
How about charter schools?
Charter schools, there are certain types of charter schools that have been shown to be very effective, and I would support a major expansion of them. KIPP charter schools in particular. That's one of the initiatives that I worked with the Obama administration to get a major expansion, a $50 million grant. They have been shown to increase, for heavily minority students, very low income areas, to increase reading and math achievement school-wide by about 5 to 10 percentile points, and to have long-term effects, increasing college attendance by about 6 percentage points. So proven effective charter schools I would also expand.
So let me just, before we move off of education, because I want to move into criminal justice and COVID and some other issues.
Yes.
But before we move on, the governor has said that he does not agree with the blueprint, not because he's not for education, but rather because, similar to what you're saying, that just throwing more money at the problem, like that without kind of the evidence behind it, doesn't make any sense. Do you agree with that? Because if we don't have the data to back up some of the reforms that are in the blueprint, or then why expand, since we've increased funding so much over the years, why not take a look at what's actually working and what's not working before spending more money?
Well, in some areas we do know what works. That's the thing. There are proven approaches. I don't see if Governor Hogan doesn't like what's in the blueprint, I don't see him going. The way I would be different from the current governor is I believe in an activist government that's trying to solve major problems like breaking the cycle of poverty and improving education statewide. So I'm very different from him in that respect, but I agree with we need to focus on what's tested and proven. Otherwise, we run the risk of funding many well-meaning programs, as we've done before, as often happens in government, well-intentioned programs that unfortunately don't deliver the hoped-for effects. So yeah, I agree. I agree with the expansion. An expansion in state education spending, but that focus on what works is absolutely critical.
Okay. Let's move into kind of what, if you believe polls, which most people don't these days, but nonetheless, two of the biggest issues, for obvious reasons, are COVID and criminal justice.
Yes.
So let's start with COVID.
Yeah.
We have a new variant that's making the rounds, and so the governor has gotten high marks, again, with polls, both in the state and nationally, for his leadership on the coronavirus. Do you agree or disagree with what people say on that front? Has Maryland been as good as people think we have been? What would you be doing differently? And I guess, more importantly, as we move forward, since this thing doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast, what should we be doing now?
So Maryland has done reasonably well. I think there's bipartisan credit due on that front in expanding vaccines and addressing COVID generally. But we've been doing reasonably well compared to other states. We have one of the higher vaccination rates in the country. However, our contest isn't with other states. Our contest is with the virus. And while 32% of Marylanders, which is the current statistic, have not been fully vaccinated, we remain vulnerable to future waves of COVID. The vaccine has been shown to be extremely effective, both in the clinical studies that have been done, but also just looking at the numbers. Vaccinated, people who are fully vaccinated, adults and youth, have less than 1/10 the rate of severe COVID, meaning hospitalization or death, than people who are unvaccinated. This is one of the most effective things out there in medicine, and it's extremely effective. The evidence is definitive. We should be pulling out every stop we have to expand use of vaccines. So I have, back in August, I called for vaccine requirements for all healthcare workers in the state because, I mean, they're around people who are immunocompromised. This is not a close call. I called for vaccine requirements also for state employees and contractors and for all school staff, teachers, and so on, and students 16 and over who are, they're in a congregate setting, so again, it really makes sense. And for students 16 and over, FDA has fully approved the use of the vaccine for them. And we require vaccines for measles and polio. I remember, when I was in school getting vaccines for polio in school. We should be doing it. So I support vaccine requirements of these kinds.
So let me ask about some other vaccines. So if there's a vaccine mandate for healthcare workers, or some have suggested that businesses should be required to,
right,
then why not for other things that the government can control? So for example, would you support, if spitballing, like if somebody goes to get a driver's license, that they need to be vaccinated before they get a driver's license? Or if somebody has public housing, before they get their housing voucher, should they be required to get vaccines? And kind of the list goes on for things that public assistance from the state of Maryland,
yes,
Medicaid or what have you. Should those things also be vaccine mandates?
Ask like a true lawyer. Well, if you're doing it here, shouldn't you require it here?
And since you're a lawyer, you can answer.
The reason I think those things should be looked at, depending on how requirements in those areas should be considered. The reason I started and initially called for healthcare settings and schools is because those are areas where, again, people are in a congregate setting, and for healthcare workers, I mean, nursing homes and the rest, they're around people who are vulnerable because many of them are immunocompromised. Same thing with schools. You're in a congregate setting. Many of the younger kids until recently could not get vaccines. And so again, there's a very strong public health argument for requiring vaccines in those areas. State employees and contractors, I called for it there as well because the state, I mean, these are people who are working for the government. I also called...
Let me stop you there for a second, though, on that one. So if a state employee themselves, I understand from the healthcare, my brother's a doctor, and just for full disclosure, my brother-in-law passed away from COVID.
I'm sorry.
So it's a personal issue, but from a public policy standpoint, a state employee or somebody that works at a big business is no more or less likely to help spread the virus than somebody who is getting their driver's license. I don't mean to pick on the poor 18-year-old going or 17-year-old
right,
going to get their driver's license, but those are people that the state gives something to, and if we're looking to vaccinate everybody, because
yes,
that really is, as you said, the only way to do it, shouldn't we be casting that net as wide as possible? So a state employee, yes, but somebody who gets public assistance or a housing voucher, we have some ability to influence that individual as well.
So there are a few things. The value, I think, is we need to do it where it's most needed. Healthcare workers, I think the example is clear. And schools, same thing. There's a very strong, in terms of spread, people are in congregate settings. Many students don't yet have vaccines. Every reason to do it there. Also, the lever that's available, that's another consideration here. So with state employees and contractors, they work for the government. We can have a requirement there. We're on strong legal ground. I would support exploring its expansion to these other areas. Legally, it might be a little bit more of a stretch. I don't know, but in general, I am receptive to the expansion of vaccine requirements using whatever levers we have.
Okay. Interesting. I don't mean to get into more controversy, but how about mask mandates? My kids go to school, and I don't know how they do it, but they have masks on all day long. For me, I have to take it down and up. It's very challenging.
Yes.
It's obviously a controversial topic. Do you think that Maryland should have a mask mandate for its kids in schools, or should that be a local decision, or some combination thereof?
Well, the reason I focus on vaccines is that vaccines are our one-way ticket out of the pandemic, unless something unexpected occurs with the Omicron variant. But as far as what we've known existing, we have the solution at hand, and we should be using it. We can all go back to a normal life if everybody were to get vaccinated. For mask mandates, the evidence is strong there. It's not, as nearly 100% efficacious against severe COVID disease and all the rest. But I would support both at the state level and the local level following public health guidance on it, which often depends on the level of spread in a particular community.
So if Garrett County doesn't have a particularly high spread, then they can make their own determination. So it shouldn't be the state board making the decision, it should just be the local boards of education?
Well, I think the state board, it might be, Garrett County, is next to Allegheny County, and so, it's not like everyone's a kingdom unto themselves. Right. So there might be a role for there's a role for the state also, if there's need at the state level to do this, across Maryland.
Challenging question, challenging issues, obviously, things that
Right.
5 years ago we would never have been talking about.
That's for sure.
Interesting. Let's move on. Criminal justice.
Yes.
And by criminal justice, it's an all-encompassing type of an issue. Obviously, you have police reform, you have public safety, sentencing, parole, probation. I mean, the list is endless. I guess let's just start with a general question. The murder rate in Baltimore City continues to be stubbornly high, and I think it's true for other jurisdictions as well. I just happen to live near Baltimore City, and so I follow it more closely.
Right.
What do we do about that, both in the short term and the long term? I've heard a lot of folks talk about jobs and things of that nature, which obviously are important long term, but probably don't, from the evidence, don't get to this year's murder rate, which is, again, staggeringly high.
Right.
And so I guess starting with the short term,
yes.
How do we get this thing under control?
Well, I agree with the urgency of this issue. This is a very high priority and would be a top priority for me as governor, to partner with Baltimore and other jurisdictions that are experiencing public safety problems. The reason is, as you pointed out, we're at 7th year in a row of more than 300 homicides per year, which is back where we were during the crime wave of the 1990s. People deserve to, this is a matter of, people deserve to be able to go about their daily activities without fearing, and send their kids to school, have them come home and all the rest, without fearing for their safety. It's a basic quality of life and safety issue. So I agree fully with the importance. And whether businesses want to locate in Baltimore City, it affects the economy. What I would do is seek a partnership with Baltimore, including Mayor Scott, the police chief, and others, to bring proven and promising programs for crime reduction from around the country, the very best, to Baltimore, with the state providing many of the resources to help ensure it's successful. So it would be a partnership. I'll give you one example. There is a crime reduction strategy called Focused Deterrence, which is actually being launched now by Police Chief Harrison and Mayor Scott, and as governor, we would help provide the resources to ensure it's successful. So I really support what they're doing. But it basically recognizes that the majority of violent crime in a city like in Baltimore and other cities is carried out by a relatively small number of individuals. Often they're repeat violent offenders and are gang involved. And the strategy, it invites them in for meetings, these people in for meetings with social service agencies and community leaders and law enforcement, and offers them a positive way forward such as job opportunities and counseling, addiction treatment if they need it, but also makes clear that if they continue to act violently, they will be the focus of extraordinary attention from law enforcement. So there's a positive way forward, but there's also a strong enforcement component. Now, in other cities, including New Orleans and the one I'm most familiar with in Oakland, California, this approach was associated with a 50% reduction in homicides over a period of about 10 years. It's very promising. This is something we should be expanding, trying out here in Baltimore, potentially other jurisdictions. If it works, do it even more widely.
So Governor Hogan has a proposal. It was in the newspaper some weeks ago, and this has been an issue in the General Assembly for years about what to do about repeat violent offenders, where unfortunately it seems like there's a revolving door of repeat violent offenders, not drug addicts, not individuals, although there are probably addiction issues that are interrelated, but somebody who picks up a gun and shoots at somebody and may not have hit them, but these individuals that kind of come in and come out of the court system and back out onto the streets. His proposal included significantly more jail time for people that are convicted a second, third, fourth time of repeat violent crimes, particularly with the use of a handgun. Would you support that proposal, and if not, why?
Well, I would want to look more carefully at that particular proposal. I do support, at least as an initial step, this focused deterrence approach that I described, because there is an important enforcement component to it. Meaning this is a relatively modest number of individuals apart from the penalties you're talking about, the idea that, we want to give them a chance. I mean, they're not currently behind bars. We want to give them a chance, a positive way forward. But a policy that also, if they continue to act violently, makes them the focus of attention from law enforcement, including prosecution and policing and all of that, that's where I would start. Because that is something, setting aside the penalty issue there, because that is something where there's evidence behind it. So there's really very promising evidence that it would actually work. That's the piece of it where I would start.
I guess just to follow up with that though, what of the individuals that don't take up the carrot, right? Like at the end of the day, there are, beyond the 300 plus murders, there are well over 1,000 non-fatal shootings that just thankfully didn't end up in the 300 plus category, ended up in the 1,000 because they just couldn't shoot straight. So, at some level, there are unfortunately people that are committing violent crimes on the street. Don't you think what we've seen is that those individuals are somewhat in a revolving door for one reason or another, whether it's getting, plea deals or the prosecution doesn't get the right case. There's a million reasons why that happens, but don't those individuals, shouldn't at some level we be saying to those folks who just keep getting convicted multiple times, you just don't belong in society at some point in time, right?
Well, I think it depends on the particular circumstance. It's hard to but again, I would start by making sure that we know who these individuals are, and by making clear to them and to prosecutors and to police that if they continue to act violently, they will be the focus of law enforcement.
How about the judicial transparency part of that? There was an article some weeks ago about something in my county, in Baltimore County, not related, was related to a violent crime, and just the governor has talked about for several years about a legislation that would increase the transparency of what's going on in the court, so have much more data coming out about the types of plea bargains that are going on in particular courtrooms and so forth. Any thoughts on that particular proposal?
I don't know about the particular proposal, but I support the goal of transparency.
Okay, interesting. Anything else on the criminal justice front that you'd
yes.
that would be in a Barren administration?
Yes. Did you say would be or will be? I think you said will be in a Barren administration. I hope
whichever
you said
way
that.
you want to say.
All right. So yes, there are other strategies that have been crime prevention approaches that have been tested and shown effective. One of them, I support a major expansion of drug courts. These are for people who are convicted of non-violent drug offenses like heroin possession. And they are given an alternative to, they've been convicted, they're offered an alternative to incarceration, which is mandatory participation in drug treatment, frequent drug testing, and close community supervision. Baltimore was one of the pioneers. Baltimore City was one of the pioneers of drug treatment courts. And they have been shown to not only be more humane, because you're not it's a partial answer to the over-incarceration problem, but there was an excellent study that came out recently showing that over a 15-year period, it reduced subsequent criminal activity by about 1/3. So it's more humane and you're getting less crime. This is something we should be doing on a much larger scale. There are other approaches for the juvenile justice system that I could also
I do want to
discuss.
talk about juvenile. Before we move on, so with drug court, there's a new proposal that's been out and has shown some promise. I don't know exactly the name of it, but it's I think they call it safe injection use facilities or something to that effect. And so former Delegate Moorheim from this area had proposed that for several years, and I think several other legislators have taken up that cause. Do you think that that's a good idea, where essentially somebody can come into a facility and with treatment options there, but safely and legally use drugs?
I think that's something that is worth exploring and testing initially on a small scale to see what happens. Does it actually result in safer outcomes, less crime, and all of that? So I support testing it on a pilot basis. The advantage of the drug court approach is the people have been convicted. There is a threat of incarceration, and a lot of folks need, and to get this alternative to incarceration, you have to participate in drug treatment and frequent drug testing and so on. So it requires a decision, and it really forces a decision on the part of the person who's been convicted and offers them a way out of this whole drug addiction thing. So that's why, and the evidence supports it. That's why that's the one I would expand.
So you did bring up juvenile justice. It's something in a former life I was the head of the juvenile law subcommittee in the House. So
Yes.
Very interested in your thoughts on the juvenile justice system. When 20 years ago we were looking at monster facilities like Charles Hickey or Cheltenham and other institutions that were basically warehouses, which have since been broken down, but still a stubborn recidivism rate. So
Right.
What does the Barren administration do on juvenile services?
Well, there are, in this area also, again, my overall focus is on expanding programs either promising or proven to work. So in juvenile justice, one approach that has been shown to be very effective is something called they're called functional family therapy. It's for youth who are involved in the criminal justice system. They've been arrested or convicted. And it pairs them and their families with a therapist who works with them on a time-limited basis to increase family functioning, because a lot of these kids come from families where there's intense negativity, and often there's no communication between the parent or caregiver and the child, and it's a completely dysfunctional situation. So the therapist works with the family, including the parents, with parent training and the rest, and communications techniques. It was shown in an excellent study in Philadelphia to reduce the rate of subsequent criminal activity by these youth by about 40%. That's a very big effect. It was a small study, so we need to see whether it works also. But this is the kind of thing we should expand in Maryland, at least on an initial basis, test it, see if it works here, and then expand it statewide.
Are these kids that you're talking about the ones that are in custody, so they're in out-of-home placement, or are these kids that are back in their community? So are these are these interventions for individuals who are already back in their community, or are you talking about bringing the family to the facilities themselves, or both?
It's mostly kids who are who are in the community already, but they're justice involved. They've been arrested, convicted, and a decision has to be made about where to send them, and this is a program that is very effective for them.
Okay. And how about kids that are in custody now, or not now, but kids that are within the system that are not deemed to be fit to go back to their homes? What do you do about that subset of individuals? Because that's the group that is really committing, those are the ones who are getting out, and if you believe, the stats would tell you those are the ones who are most likely to recidivate. What do we do on them?
So that's an area where we need to test innovative new ideas, including some that are promising. In Chicago, there was an excellent test of what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's, having these kids think differently and teaching them how to think more slowly rather than respond immediately if there's so they think in a more, thoughtful way about what the outcomes are going to be and so on. That was shown to be promising. There are things like that, different kinds of therapy. There are also different kinds when they are eventually released to the community, certain kinds of foster care in families that are trained in behavior management that are shown to be that have been found to be very promising. But this is an area where we should be trying a lot of different approaches, testing them, see what works. For those that work, we expand them. For those that don't, we move on to something else.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to switch gears. I want to make sure and hit as many topics as we can in this hour. There was an article, I think just yesterday or 2 days ago, having to do with a court case, and the issue is renters. And renters, regardless of what the Court of Appeals did. It's obviously a big issue, particularly during COVID and evictions, and there was a whole lot of legislation around this right to counsel. I'm just throwing a lot of things at you. One of the things that was thrown out yesterday, or in the article, was a delegate had talked about having a system where you could not be evicted. Not be evicted, but the landlord would have to re-let to you unless they had good cause to do otherwise. So essentially, your lease keeps going on in perpetuity unless there's a good cause not to lease to the individual. I throw that out to you, that specific issue, but also just in general, what does the Barren administration do on this very hot topic?
So, on this particular issue, I want to look at that more carefully. But here's how I would think about it, okay, and the lens through which I would view it. Right now we're in a crisis, both renters and landlords, and the Hogan administration has done a very high percentage. I think there are over 100,000 renters across the state of Maryland that are in arrears right now. And that affects them, it affects the landlord. It is a major problem because of COVID. And the Hogan administration has done a poor job in this area of getting out a substantial amount of relief that's provided by the federal government for renters and landlords. We're doing much. I think we've gotten out 26% of the federal funds in the relief. Virginia has gotten over half of it out. New Jersey has done much better. Even Pennsylvania has done better. We're lagging. This is a question of the operational functioning of government. How do you stand up a program quickly and get the money out to people who are in need? So I would, long story short, that's the most pressing issue regarding rent right now in the state. I would bring someone who is an expert at running government programs, just making the trains run on time. You remember when the Obamacare website was rolled out in 2013 and it was a catastrophe? It was not functional. They brought in Jeff Zients and within a few months it was fixed. I was somebody like that when I was in government in the Clinton administration. I won awards for reinventing government. That's the kind of person that I would bring in to make sure that emergency rental assistance gets out the door quickly. That's number one. You're looking for number two.
I am. Well, because at some level, just having tax money go to landlords or tax money go to
Right.
renters is going to dry, and so
Right.
the question is from a holistic standpoint, right? Because there are lots of proposals that are out there that would, are interesting, and so
Yes.
I'm curious about from a legislative standpoint what your thoughts are on those things as well.
Well, I do support the right to counsel, for instance, for renters, because landlords almost invariably have it. It should be a level playing field, and I would support use of some of the new federal money that's available to help pay for that.
Okay.
One thing in terms of the specific question you asked, it is very important to provide rights to renters. I agree entirely with that, but you can't do it's a balancing act, because landlords, we need landlords to be in the business to be in this area, to be participating in the economy, making properties available. The supply has to be there. So it can't be a system that is so onerous for landlords. So yes, there should be that top priority is fairness for the renter, but it also has to be something that works for landlords as well. That's the balance.
I guess the question is, based on that specific quote in that specific piece of legislation, is why should a landlord have to be forced to rent to somebody when their lease is up? I'm trying to wrap my head around what that would mean if I was a landlord and I wanted to turn my apartment building into a basketball court, which I certainly would. Why should I be prohibited legally from doing? I'm not sure it's even legal, but why should I be prohibited legally from doing that?
Well, again, on the landlords, I think we have to make sure. I don't know the specifics of this particular proposal, but I do think this has to be something that is fair to the landlords as well, and doesn't discourage people, landlords, from being landlords.
Okay. Let's switch gears again. The General Assembly is back in session right now as we sit here, dealing with the issue of redistricting, which does not poll all that high but it polls very high with politicians. So I guess the question is, the governor, this is a every 10-year thing. The governor has talked about and put together his own independent commission, nonpartisan commission, which for all intents and purposes seems like it was fairly free from influence from the outside. They have their maps, and the state does, and the legislature does its maps, and the court will have their say. Doesn't it make more sense to have a group that's outside of politicians doing their own maps? And kind of, what are your thoughts on that? It was a big deal for Larry Hogan. He certainly ran on it 8 years ago. What do you think about it?
Well, I strongly support federal legislation to ensure nonpartisan gerrymandering, districting across the United States. Because the current system where each state, Democrat or Republican, whoever controls the legislature, this is incumbent protection policy, basically. We want open, competitive elections. That's something I think that is extremely important. As to Maryland, if every other state, if all the Republican states are doing partisan gerrymandering, and we have a fair and open process, which would be the ideal, under that circumstance, it is more of sort of unilateral disarmament. And we're not, so I support it on a federal level, a nonpartisan process. I would also support Maryland partnering with another Republican state, where both, Maryland is a largely Democratic state, the other state is largely Republican, but reaching a bilateral, or maybe there could be a few states involved in this, agreement to do nonpartisan gerrymandering across the state so that no one is unilaterally disarming, no party is unilaterally disarming, and we can get fairness across all of these states.
So Maryland should not on its own do this, but rather only do this if you have partnerships with other states. So keep doing political gerrymandering until others also decide not to do political gerrymandering.
Yeah, but you make us sound like a passive player in all of this. The governor can make this their priority, try to find partners in other states, other governors who will do this. there are Republican governors who have supported this in the past.
How about at the Maryland state level? So one where we don't need to deal with other states. So the legislature itself doing its own maps. And to be fair, although I never really was involved in it, I certainly had voted on the maps a couple times when I was down there. Should, at the very least, for Maryland's own maps, for the legislative districting maps, should it be a more independent commission, nonpartisan, rather than politicians kind of choosing their own neighborhoods and trying to get additional neighborhoods in their districts?
In those cases, yes, I'm more receptive to that approach.
Okay. All right. Well, I got one.
All right.
Another big issue that's going to be down there, certainly this year, and we could talk forever on this, is the issue of marijuana. That's going to be a big ticket issue in the General Assembly this session.
Yes.
Maryland has a robust medical cannabis program, which took a long time to get to, and also has decriminalized at least small amounts of marijuana. Now the new look is recreational use. Thoughts on that issue, and what would the Barren administration do on this?
I think you meant to say, what will a Barren administration? Okay. So
you are a lawyer.
I would. I support the decriminalization that's been done. I also support what's been proposed, which is putting it up to a referendum on whether to legalize recreational marijuana, and the polls, at least currently, show that that would pass.
All right, so I'm not going to let you end there. Why? I've always asked this question, and I dealt with this issue with fracking, which people wanted to also put up for referendum, which I thought was a terrible idea.
Yeah.
And we just banned it. Why should anything in Maryland that is referendum goes into our Constitution? If the polls are so overwhelming in the General Assembly, like, why should this be something that goes to referendum and not just the General Assembly to do or not to do? I'm not sure why marijuana itself should be in the Maryland Constitution. And putting aside the referendum, do you support the legalization, not just the referendum itself?
So the referendum is a path that has been, proposed by Speaker Jones and others. So it is sort of the current proposal that's on the table, and I support that path forward on how to make a decision. In terms of, that's the most straightforward way I think that's out there to get it, for people to get an answer.
I guess I'm just curious. Just in following that, like, why that issue goes on referendum, but a myriad of hundreds of other pieces of legislation which are equally big or important don't go to referendum. Gambling went that way.
Right.
And there was an attempt to put fracking that way. Why marijuana over all other issues?
Because, something like fracking and marijuana and also gambling is more a question about, to a large extent, not about values. Sort of what kinds of behaviors are we going to condone or not condone, and so on. That is, and people, the voters, are fully informed in making that because they know they can think about what they value. There are questions, about does marijuana lead to, other drugs and so on, as a gateway drug and all of that. But most of the issue is a question of values that I think the voters are, appropriately empowered to make.
So not assuming, what do you think about it? Do you think that we should have recreational use of marijuana in the state of Maryland?
Well,
let's just make the assumption the voters pass it. I understand the answer could be, well, I'll do what the voters say. But before that happens, if the General Assembly passed the bill this year,
yeah,
and you were the governor right now, would you sign that piece of legislation?
So I would be favorably inclined. You're not going to get me on this. I'd be favorably inclined to sign it, based on what I would want to look into it further. In general, this is a matter of personal liberty and decision about how to, control one's, life and decisions and body. So The one thing I would want to look at a little bit more closely is the evidence about, is this a gateway to other kinds of drugs and so on. That's how I would think about it, but based on what I know, would be favorably inclined to sign it.
It takes a while.
All right, sorry.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes left, and I definitely want to give you an opportunity at the end just to kind of wrap up and anything that we haven't covered, because there's a million issues that we haven't, and I'm sorry about that, but the hour goes quickly. I wanted to do a couple of kind of lightning round type stuff, see if I can get some yes/nos on some issues, particularly some issues that are important to the bar. Judicial elections is an issue that keeps coming up every session, and it kind of gets a little further and then it takes a step back. Maryland, as you know, appoints district court, appoints court of special appeals, appoints court of appeals, elects judges in the circuit court. There's an appointment and then there's an election. I guess just the general question is, should Maryland elect its judges in the circuit court, or should we do away with judicial elections?
That's an issue I want to look at further before in general, I am inclined. My inclination is to support appointed judges rather than elected judges, because the role of the judiciary is to protect individual rights. It's not necessary, and sometimes be anti-majoritarian. So you want people who are sort of insulated from the political process as much as possible. That being said, I want to look at that specific issue a little bit further, but that's the general lens through which I would view it.
Yeah. Another one is, I guess, I'm not even sure how to ask this question, but last session, some overly aggressive activism was taking place, and there's this rise where legislators were having their houses protested, and I mean, just things that I never saw before in the general, just awful things. And I guess, just any thoughts that you have on the rise of this hyper-partisanship, things we have not seen in Maryland really ever until now, and certainly it's going on all over the country.
Yes. Well, I know that's an issue you've thought a lot about, and a part of politics that you have been very concerned about. I am as well. I mean, my background really, I've been a lifelong Democrat because I believe in an activist government. I believe in advancing racial and social equality and opportunity for all, not just the privileged few. But I've always, throughout my career, worked very well with Republicans, with the Bush administration, Republicans in Congress, and Democrats. And that's, I mean, I was an appointee of President Bush, for instance, as well as President Clinton. A lot of people worked with, just the issue of whether I was a Democrat or just didn't come up a lot of the time. So I support a problem-solving approach. In my own communications, one of my goals, I think every candidate and every elected official has a responsibility to tone down the rhetoric. That's one of the things I really like about President Biden. Not to be overly partisan, not to be out there trying to score political points. When I make a communication, I always try to present it in terms of the principle that's being advanced and why this is good public policy, and not, why the other guy is a bum or other woman is a bum, whatever it happens to be. I think, especially in these times, it is essential for public officials and those seeking office to scale back the rhetoric, to treat each other with civility. Maryland is one of the few states in the nation, or it's one of the states in the nation where, and I would credit Governor Hogan with this as well, where the parties talk to each other in a reasonably civil way. That's very important, and it's something that I would work very hard to maintain as governor.
Good. We have 5 minutes left, and I know you want to talk a little bit about evidence-based budgeting, which is a big-ticket issue on your website and in other things that you've been talking about. Why don't you go ahead and tell us what does that mean, and if you could, just give me an example of what that looks like here in Maryland.
Well, I want to bring a new governing approach to our state. One where we are not just rolling out the next new plan, the next new unproven plan, and hoping it's going to work. We've done that. I mean, we've been doing that for decades. Are our kids going to look back 20 years from now and say, you know, we had all these persistent problems, I described them earlier, education, wages, poverty, rising healthcare costs. Are they going to look back and say that we just kept doing the same thing again and again? Or, this is what I want to offer, will they say that Maryland led the nation, that we pioneered a new governing approach where decisions about spending and resources are made based on evidence about what actually works to improve people's lives? That's the future I want for Maryland.
So what's an example of something that we've been doing? Because obviously I voted for 21 budgets and hoped that they were doing that type of an analysis. What's an example of something, a big ticket thing or small ticket, that we have in our budgets that you would put under the heading of this is not evidence-based budgeting, this is something that is a waste?
So the largest job training program for adult and dislocated workers in the United States there's a federal program. It's a multi-billion-dollar Department of Labor program. In Maryland alone, it's tens of millions of dollars a year. There was a large federal study that came out showing that the workers who got training under this program ended up with wages that were roughly the same as the equivalent group of workers who didn't get training. So this is a classic program that is well-intentioned. It is not improving economic outcomes for these workers who are devoting their time and energy to it. There are proven effective job training programs that are far more effective. One of them, my philanthropic team funded to move, it originated in the Bronx. We funded its expansion to Silver Spring. It's since expanded to Baltimore. It's called Perscolas, but that's just one example. These are programs that, as I described earlier, are focused sharply on fast-growing parts of the economy, like IT and healthcare. And they partner with local employers, both in the design of the training, so that it meets the employer's needs, and the employers they provide paid internships to the trainees and actually pick up half the bill. Those have been shown to increase earnings by 20 to 40%. So we should be using that existing money that is not achieving the objectives on things that could really make a difference in people's lives and economic outcomes.
Okay. It's a good, I'm going to segue into our last 2 minutes, to give John Barren a chance to talk to the 27,000 members of the Maryland State Bar Association as to why should, after all of this, come Election Day, why should they elect you, John Barren, to be our next governor?
So should I talk to you or to the Bar Association?
Either way.
Okay, well, here's what I would say. That all of the candidates you're going to hear from on the Democratic side, we all support similar goals. We all want to improve education in our state. We all want to reduce poverty and improve wages and all the rest. The way that I am different is this. I recognize that to achieve those goals, it is simply not enough to roll out yet another unproven plan or program, because however well-intentioned, many plans and programs just don't work. We've seen that again and again when the results are actually measured. So if we're really going to make progress on these long-standing problems, if we're really going to move the needle on stagnant wages and the rest, we need to focus like a laser beam on expanding programs that have been tested in the real world and shown to make a big difference in people's lives. I've given a couple examples here. There are a number of additional ones. Statewide tutoring for struggling first and second graders early in elementary school could make an enormous difference. These kinds of highly effective job training programs which we would scale up statewide in a partnership with businesses across the state, could make an enormous difference. That's what's really needed. If it's just one unproven plan after the next, we're spinning wheels, and we're going to be here in another 20 years. You'll be interviewing who knows who, the next governor's election, and we'll be talking about the same problems. If you go back to the 1990s and look at the governor's elections back then, they're all talking about the urgent need to improve education, particularly the schools in Baltimore. They're talking about, then it was the cocaine epidemic, now it's the opioid epidemic. We need something to break out of that. That's what I'm offering.
All right. Well, John Barren, thank you for this hour. It's gone quickly. I just want to say thank you for joining us here. Again, Maryland State Bar Association partnering with Stevenson University on this beautiful Stevenson campus. And I just want to say thank you for joining me today and sharing all of your ideas, and wish you the best of luck on your campaign, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Well, I want to say you're welcome, and thank you in return. Thank you for moderating here, and to the host and the Bar Association, and to Stevenson as well.
Great. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Maryland State Bar Association, thank you so much for joining us here today.